experts in the CIA, on the National Intelligence Council, and on the National Security Council. They all agreed this is a terrible mistake.
Today, we're tackling one of the most critical and controversial topics in modern geopolitics, the Russia-Ukraine war. And joining me is Scott Horton.
Is this the most dangerous thing that's happened since the end of the Second World War? Yeah, it is.
The author of Provoked, How Washington Started the New Cold War with Russia and the Catastrophe in Ukraine. Scott Horton pulls back the curtain, offering a meticulous and provocative account of how decades of U.S. foreign policy have set the stage for this devastating conflict, from NATO's relentless expansion into Eastern Europe, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, to the Balkan and Chechen wars, new missile defense systems, and so much more.
They take the welfare out of your paycheck, then they make a bomb out of it, and then they explode some property.
Right.
But the guy who made the bomb, he got his dividend check. That's the racket.
Scott pieces together a narrative that shows how this war didn't just happen, it was provoked.
And these guys are gangsters. Like, I'm not making any specific accusations against any specific people, but
Today, we'll explore the policies, decisions, and missed opportunities that brought us here and ask the critical question, could this war have been avoided? What lessons must be learned to prevent future catastrophe? This is a conversation packed with history, context, and hard truths. So let's get into it. Keeping it real with Jillian Michaels. Scott, is there a man with dementia dragging us into World War III?
Sure seems possible. I lately have been trying to calm people down about this a little bit, if only because I have had some people contact me on Twitter who are seemingly, like, legitimately terrified that we're going to have a nuclear war very soon. And I think probably that's not going to happen. And whatever, if I am wrong, then I'll be dead in the thing and it won't matter anyway, I guess.
Good way of looking at it.
Yes, and listen, everything I'm about to say to you is basically just made up speculation, but I think you'll see where I'm going with it. I am betting that the White House discussion was that since they lost the election to a guy who said he wants to negotiate a peace deal as soon as possible, and that they are betting that Putin will sit on his hands and not do anything too crazy if they go ahead and escalate with these longer range missile strikes into Russia. And that he'll essentially take it on the chin and turn the other cheek and bide his time until Trump comes. Now, he's already deployed new hypersonic missiles that we have not seen before in a demonstration, which, he didn't hit Poland with them. He didn't hit London with them, right? But he did hit Ukraine with them in a demonstration that, he can also escalate this thing and ramp it up as well. It's not like he was going to do nothing.
Right.
But I guess, look, if I was there, I would have definitely recommended against it. But I think that the Biden people are probably right, that he is not going to say, well, fine, and start bombing Warsaw and Paris and Berlin and London and dare us to stop them with nuclear weapons. I don't think that's going to happen in the lame duck presidency of this demented old coot, as you correctly described him there. And I should add, and this is just an outrage. This is unbelievable. This is equal to any scandal in all of American political history that I could possibly think of, other than just the war itself and participating in this thing the way they have, is that this announcement, they said in the New York Times that this decision was a split decision in the White House, that Jake Sullivan, who was Hillary Clinton's man and is the national security advisor and is no dove, that he was against it and tried to argue against it, and that Biden went ahead and listened to Anthony Blinken, his Secretary of State, instead. And thing is, it just seems to me, never mind how much we're going to disagree with it anyway. Right. But to think that they would make such a step based on a split decision, when Biden's really most trusted right-hand foreign policy advisor is saying that he thought that we should not, or at least he told the Times that is really something else. And quite frankly, all other things being equal, Joe Biden should be impeached and removed from office for daring to escalate this war inside Russia. And by the way, for people who don't know, these ATACMS, by all reports in the Wall Street Journal and elsewhere, say that it takes American Special Operations Forces or CIA officers to fire these weapons. The Ukrainians do not have the sophisticated training required to fire these ATACMS. So these are Western forces, Western combat forces, boots on the ground in Ukraine, participating in firing these missiles into Russia. And now they've added British Storm Shadows. I'm sorry, I'm a little bit behind on the very, very latest news. I know they've given permission to fire British Storm Shadows and French long-range missiles as well. I don't know whether that has commenced yet. Very well may have. And so, yes, this is extremely dangerous. And they have, as you may know, the Ukrainians, with British support, launched an invasion of Kursk inside Russia in September. And the Russians have not made the greatest effort. I mean, they've been fighting them, but they did not turn around, drive them right back out again. They're still there. The Russians have only taken about, the last time I checked was about a week ago, I guess. They had retaken about half of Kursk, but half of it is still under the control of Ukrainian forces on the Russian side of the border. So yes, is this the most dangerous thing that's happened since the end of the Second World War? Yeah, it is. This is as bad as the worst crisis in Berlin. This is as bad as, worse than the invasion of Afghanistan and the heightening of tensions there. The early Reagan years, 1983, when they thought there really might be a nuclear war. This is at least equivalent to that. Cuban Missile Crisis levels of danger.
Okay. Well, you answer that question for me. Scott, I've done my best here to try to learn about the opposite argument. So I want to try to hit you with that right now. And
Sure.
and then of course I want to get to the bottom of how did we get here? Because it's my understanding that there were numerous off-ramps along the way. And not only did we not take those off-ramps, we, as your book so aptly puts it, we provoked this entire thing. So my first question, right, is here we are. Well, he's got North Korean troops in there. We have to do something. Well, he's a despot. He's like Hitler. What if we don't do something? He's invaded all of these other countries, Georgia, the Chechens, Ukraine, and we didn't do something. Now we have to do something. So that's what I'm hearing from the counter argument of this is he's created he's all of these atrocities he's backed, right? He's invaded sovereign nations. He's escalating things by bringing in North Korean troops, and we need to do something. What would your answer be to that then? Because it sort of makes sense when you hear it. You're like, oh, well, okay, I guess we need to do something.
Well, there's a lot of different responses to that. The first one would be, why would the people you want to do something be the people who invaded and destroyed Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, Libya, and Syria? The Americans who killed 4 million people in the first generation of this century, who drove 37 million people out of their homes, the greatest refugee crisis since World War II. And as we saw in Europe, with millions of Muslims coming to Europe and, creating a massive destabilization throughout that entire continent. The Obama's dirty war in Syria, where he backed bin Ladenite head chopping suicide bombers until they built the caliphate. And then he had to launch Iraq War III to destroy it again. And the Americans are the most dangerous. Washington, D.C., our foreign policy establishment and military establishment, they are the aggressors. They are the world empire. They're not defending anybody from anything. They're the bad guys. Just because we're from here doesn't change that. Look at who's been in charge. It's been Bill Clinton and George Bush and Barack Obama in charge. That's not attacking my country. That's attacking the individual men and women in charge of policy in this country. They have been an absolute disaster. It's no different, Jillian, honestly, than if Joe Biden had gone ahead and won the election of '88 and we had had President Biden this whole time. Okay? Like if I told you Joe Biden has been making bad decisions this whole time, you wouldn't say, hey, don't attack my country. You would say, yeah, like that guy's bad on everything. Of course he is. But Joe Biden represents the consensus. He's been in power. He was first elected to the Senate in 72, took office in 73. He was involved in every bit of this the whole time. He was for it all. So that ought to be your first clue. It was wrong. It was what the Clintons, the Bushes, McCain, and Biden agreed about what to do. So just the fact that we're from here doesn't mean that the benefit of the doubt goes to Washington, D.C. It just doesn't. That's first. Why are you going to hire Lex Luthor to stop the bad guy? Are you mistaking him for Superman? Because he's not. That's first. Okay, secondly, all of this stuff about, oh, he did this and he did that. All of that, of course, is out of context. The Georgia war, that's all America's fault. The Ukraine war, that's all America's fault. The Syria war, that's all America's fault. Now, Chechnya, that's on the Russians. But then again, look at the situation they were in at the time. Bill Clinton and Al Gore took their side in the Chechen war. Now, they backed the terrorists against him too. But certainly rhetorically, they said, listen, this is like Abraham Lincoln holding his country together. Clinton and Al Gore both said that because the Russian Federation, when all of these provinces were breaking away from the Soviet Union, not just the Warsaw Pact, but even the so-called Soviet Republic states were breaking away, and all that was left was the Russian Federation. Of course, Moscow had to draw the line somewhere, and they drew it in Chechnya. And as I show in the book, even though Bill Clinton was helping them kill the Chechens, he was also helping the Chechens kill them. And the reason why is because of a bunch of dirty pipeline politics, preventing the Russians from being able to pump Caspian oil and gas up through the Caucasus Mountains into Russia and through to Europe. Instead, they wanted to go through Georgia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Turkey to the Mediterranean and to cut the Iranians and the Russians out. So they were willing to back Osama bin Ladenite murderous terrorists in the Chechen wars. That was Bill Clinton and W. Bush. So yes, the way the Russians fought the wars in Chechnya are absolutely horrifyingly evil, equivalent to what George W. Bush did in Fallujah. When it comes to Georgia and Ukraine, that's like 95% on the USA, 5% on Russia for finally appeasing the enemy. America always says that our enemies are Hitler, and we're always the poor, hapless British and French trying to appease them. But just look at it from the other point of view. They're the ones appeasing us constantly, and then sometimes finally drawing the line and pushing back.
Okay, I love the distinction because people tend to think like, oh, Tulsi has espoused a part of your position, and it's trying to understand the role that we've played, and then she's immediately labeled a Russian asset, anti-American, an apologist for Putin. And I like the clarification that this isn't about what America stands for. This isn't about the American people. It's about the people in power in our country and what they're doing. And I really want to understand why. So before we get to that,
you know what? Can I just address the Tulsi Gabbard thing for a second here?
Go ahead.
Because it's such a great example, right? I saw this debate the other day. Dave Smith got in an argument on Piers Morgan with Joe Walsh, and Joe Walsh says, well, she says things that Russia would like her to say or something.
Russia propaganda. Yes.
Yeah. She also was just promoted from major to lieutenant colonel when she changed from the National Guard to the Army Reserve. She is a serving officer in the U.S. Army right now. So either her commanding officers keep promoting a traitor or there's nothing to this at all. It's one or the other. It's completely binary. Okay? And the answer, of course, is that Tulsi Gabbard is an American patriot. She's no Russian partisan whatsoever in any sense at all. They are just lying about her, period. When she went to, in their words, side with Bashar al-Assad in the Barack Obama years, what she was really doing was she was siding against al-Qaeda in Iraq, in Syria. America and its allies had switched sides. After fighting for the Shiites in Iraq War II, they said we got to make up for that by switching sides and essentially backing the same Sunni insurgency we'd fought in Iraq War II, backing them on the Syrian side of the line, calling them the Free Syrian Army, calling them Jabhat al-Nusra. And Tulsi Gabbard, remember, she fought in Iraq War II,
Yes.
she was stationed at a medical base, but she gets like a combat badge. She was shot at, she didn't pull triggers, but she got shelled at that Balad Air Base. She saw violence in that war. She was at a medical base, so she saw young guys dying, crying for their mama in that war. And now, just 2-3 years later, she's being told your enemy in the last war are now the moderate rebels, and that's whose side we're on because their enemies are friends with Iran. And so now America prefers Al Qaeda because at least they hate the Shiites. And Tulsi Gabbard said no. Absolutely not, simply because she could tell the difference between the shirts and the skins, okay? And so, in other words, and I know this sounds crazy for people who don't quite understand. I wrote a previous book called Enough Already that explains it very well, that essentially what happened was Barack Obama's Syria policy was so absolutely insane and upside down and treasonous that when she spoke simple truth about it, she was essentially accusing them of outright Benedict Arnold level behavior. And so they absolutely freaked out and panicked and threw all of this mud at her. Remember also, she endorsed Bernie Sanders against Hillary Clinton because Hillary was so bad on Syria. And so they just lied. They just smeared her. And Hillary Clinton said she was a Russian asset. Remember what she said? She said she's a Russian asset and she's going to run as a third party candidate to split the vote against Biden to help the Russian agent Trump. That's what Hillary Clinton said. Is that what Tulsi Gabbard did? No. Hillary Clinton's just a liar. And then the fraud, Robert Windrum at NBC News, wrote this absolutely ridiculous article saying that Russian bots on Twitter liked her, which meant nothing. I mean, the article was just absolute trash, but it took up 700 words. And so people could pretend that there was some substance to it and try to use it against her. It was just absolutely nothing but a fraud. And I have to say, by the way, that I strongly disagree with her about the war against the Sunnis. I mean, she says things like Hamas wants to take over the world and stuff. So her war, if she's in charge, her war against the bin Ladenites, I do not endorse. She is not a Hortonian on foreign policy, but she is no Putinite either in any way. She is no kind of partisan for Russia, for Syria. None of these accusations, none of them have any weight whatsoever, okay? She was just promoted to lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army. That should be the end of that.
Okay, holy shit. I think it is.
Sorry, I got a chip on my shoulder about these guys.
No, I like it. Scott, Scott, hold on. I want to warn you that you are catching me up on numerous conflicts that have gone on for numerous decades, and I know nothing about any of them. So
I'll send you my old book too.
Slow down. Okay, so holy shit, dude. All right, let's go back to, oh my God, you gave me so much there that I'm gonna have to figure out how to disseminate it real quick. So
this is fun.
So the first thing I want to understand, okay, because you've mentioned so many different things that I'm grabbing onto as you're talking, like Hillary Clinton or Obama's policy towards Syria was treasonous. And, we started this back when Bush was in office. And, okay, let's begin with, before I can even combat you, I need to understand it. And I'm combating you to play devil's advocate. So my first question is, obviously this has been our foreign policy then, as you're suggesting, for decades. How long has this been our foreign policy? Can you put it to me in a nutshell? Because it seems like we're over here in we're in Syria, and then we're over there, we're in Iraq. And what is the United States foreign policy? This interventionist foreign policy.
Okay, well, it depends on how.
And why is that our policy? Let's start with that. Because holy shit, forgive me. I feel like I'm going to get a.
It's okay. And I apologize.
No,
I apologize for bringing up like too many details.
No, but
I should maybe use some broader strokes in some cases. Look, the way to understand it, frankly, is this, okay? At the end of the Second World War, America inherited all of the world empires.
Got it.
We inherited the British, the French, and whatever other Western, the German. They didn't have too much of a foreign empire, but they had a bit of one. But we inherited essentially all of Western Europe's control over the global South and the East. The exceptions to that was the communists in the Soviet Union and then in China after the Revolution of 49. And then, of course, both sides there then helped the North Koreans and the North Vietnamese and, later the Cambodians and whatever other communist movements around the world. So essentially, and remember, in the Second World War, every industrial power was destroyed except the USA was standing, right? We're untouchable over here in North America. So America was like, I forget the exact number, forgive me, but it was like 60 or 70% of global GDP was
Got it.
us, the middle part of North America, right? So they had all the power in the world to just do whatever they wanted and essentially extend everywhere they wanted, except where the Reds were keeping us out. And
Okay, that was my question because the
right,
USSR was also simultaneously growing as a
right.
world power, right? And that's when the Cold
Mhm.
War began.
That's the Cold War, right?
Got it. All
So
right, I'm with
in
you.
the right. So in the Second World War, on the Eastern Front, it was the Soviets fighting the Germans. And when they defeated the Germans, remember they got to Berlin before the Yanks did. When they defeated the Germans, Joseph Stalin ended up keeping all of that land between Russia and West Germany.
Got it.
So his troops and forcibly, made those people accept communist puppet governments and forced them to join the Warsaw Pact military alliance with the Soviet Union. So they didn't really call them Soviet republics, but they were Eastern Europe. All of Eastern Europe was essentially enslaved to Soviet communism. And
Got it.
so that was then the basis of the Cold War was we have to use all of our power to keep that from getting any further out of control.
Which
Right.
seems like a good thing in Scott.
And that's what a lot of people thought. And you know what? Let's leave that part of it aside because there was a lot of horrible wars like Korea and Vietnam and other horrible things that happened during the Cold War. But let's fast forward a bit to just the end of the last Cold War in 1989, say right around there, 89, 90, 91, as the Soviet Union is falling apart. They're letting Eastern Europe go. And there were a lot of Americans who had been Cold War hawks. People like, say, for example, Pat Buchanan or Jude Wanniski, Chalmers Johnson, and a lot of these guys who were hardcore anti-communist, pro-containment, pro-Cold War guys, Reaganites. But then when the Soviet Union collapsed, they said, all right, great, now we can come home. We saved the republic from the evils of global communism, so
Right.
now we can be a constitutional republic again, and including even the book begins with the new book, Provoked, begins with Ronald Reagan's former UN ambassador, Jeane Kirkpatrick, saying, great, now we can be a normal country in a normal time, right? So that was on the table as a choice. But what
Meaning
happened?
for Russia can be a normal country in a normal time, or
Well,
we can
that
say
weekend.
we can
That's
stop
right.
fighting this Cold War. Got it.
That's right.
We can stop
That's right.
escalating, stop growing missiles. Perfect.
Yep.
And we simultaneously promise that, forgive my rudimentary understanding here, here's another one that I wanted to ask you is, didn't NATO exist to fight the USSR's expansion? And we subsequently promised, as the USSR fell, we won't expand NATO.
Right.
Okay, so what is
You're
that
right on point.
NATO
This is
piece?
it. Yeah. So this is exactly what we're talking about, right?
Okay.
So at the end of the Cold War, people like Pat Buchanan and these others said, now we can give up our empire. After all, the only reason that we were exercising so much control over Europe, over the Middle East, over even Africa and Latin America was to keep the communists out. But if communism is dead,
Oh, I
then we
see.
can bring our troops home. We can save that money. We can end all of our various states of emergency. We can readopt
Oh.
George Washington's Constitution that's been essentially suspended since the end of the Second World War. And then, but what did the empire do? The empire told Pat Buchanan and Jude Wanniski and Chalmers Johnson, forget it. We're not cashing our peace dividend. We're staying at war. And America will have military dominance in the Middle East, in Europe, all of Europe, and East Asia forever. And they
Why?
announced the
Money?
policy. Well, there are a lot of different reasons. It's certainly at the expense of most of the economy to benefit certain arms manufacturers and certain connected interests. The rest of us are paying. I mean, you think about it. They
Yep.
take the wealth right out of your paycheck, then they make a bomb out of it, and then they explode some property with that bomb. This
Right.
is all net negative, right? But the
Right.
guy who made the bomb, he got his dividend check, right, So the money, as Garrett Garrett said, in American empire, all the money is made when the money goes out. We don't, like, say, for example, loot the capital city and just take all the gold. Actually, they did steal Iraq's gold, but mostly they don't just loot the place. The looting is of the American people in paying for the weapon systems, especially to enforce the empire. That's the racket. And remember, I know you already know this. Your whole audience already knows this. Sometimes we forget. It was Dwight David Eisenhower who had been the general who won the war in Europe for the West in World War II, the 5-star general, who was then the 2-term Republican president of the United States. On his last day in office, he said, everybody, you gotta be careful of the military-industrial complex.
A vital element in keeping the peace is our military establishment. Our arms must be mighty, ready for instant action, so that no potential aggressor may be tempted to risk his own destruction. Our military organization today bears little relation to that known of any of my predecessors in peacetime, or indeed by the fighting men of World War II or Korea. Until the latest of our world conflicts, the United States had no armaments industry. American makers of plowshares could, with time and as required, make swords as well. But we can no longer risk emergency improvisation of national defense. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. Added to this, 3.5 million men and women are directly engaged in the defense establishment. We annually spend on military security alone more than the net income of all United States corporations. Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together.
It's not a conspiracy, right? It's an economic description of a combination of arms manufacturers, the congressmen who appropriate the money,
Right.
and the executive branch military officials who decide which manufacturers get the contract to make the weapons, and that these people all have an interest in keeping their game going. And Eisenhower, again, he had been a 5-star general, and he said, God help the next president who doesn't have the influence over the army that I have, or they're just going to run right over him. And I don't know 100%, but I think most people think it was, the right wing of the military that shot the next president in the head for daring to get in their way.
Oh, shit. You're saying
What
the
I'm saying is-
military-industrial complex might have shot Kennedy in the head because, why, the Cuban Missile Crisis? Because he was trying to de-escalate?
Yeah, and look, I have to say, this is actually not my thesis. And when I was a kid, I really was into a lot of conspiracy stuff, but I never really got too deep into Kennedy because there's 100 books about it, and I just don't want to read them all and have to sift it and decide myself.
Okay,
And,
sorry.
And to me, he was nothing but the Barack Obama of the 1960s anyway, so I just really don't care that much.
Got
I
it.
don't know. But
Okay, so
I should say, I do know very good historians who say that, yes, after the missile crisis, he said we have to end the Cold War.
Right.
And that he really tried to marginalize the more militaristic parts of his government and negotiate. He did negotiate the test ban treaty and supposedly really wanted to end the Cold War in his second term. I don't know if that's really true. I know that, for example, Noam Chomsky absolutely rejects that thesis and said that he was nothing but Hillary Clinton his whole career until he took that bullet. I know that, Gareth Porter, my very good friend and a absolutely brilliant historian, he believes, and he's not saying who took the shot, but he is saying that Kennedy was getting substantially better on foreign policy and certainly thus then providing the motive there if he was going to get in their way of escalating Vietnam. But anyway, just point being that even if we just leave that in speculation there about Jack Kennedy,
got it.
Exactly what happened to him there.
Okay.
It's still the reason that's even plausible at all is because we all understand the beast that was created with the National Security Act in 47 after the Second World War. They created the CIA, they created the Department of Defense, and these guys built a world empire. And at the end of the Cold War, they weren't willing to give it up. And so they came up with whatever doctrines that they could to justify it, including, you might even remember, there was a time before they could really get the war on terrorism going where they were trying to make like real nation state enemies out of drug dealers in Latin America, trying to pretend like this is why we need a standing army is to fight cocaine kingpins and this kind of stuff, because it was going to take too long to find more to do in the Middle East to get Iraq War II up and running. So part of that time in the 90s, but it was just, remember they even made all the Harrison Ford, Tom Clancy movies about, stopping the drug dealers and all this. They had to find a way to justify keeping the machine going. When, as I say, even hawks like Pat Buchanan, Gene Kirkpatrick, all of these people were saying, well, we don't have to do this anymore. Now we can be a normal country again. And they had to find reasons to expand. And then so one of these was, we have to dominate the Middle East to prevent the likes of Saddam Hussein from dominating it. Yeah, right. And
that's the argument. Okay.
Europe,
is that all these guys are despots. They're all Hitlers in the making.
That's right.
And
that's right. If we're not there, they would be.
Yes.
So we better be there first.
Is there no truth to that though, Scott?
No, there's not. Look, I'll give you a perfect example in the case of Ukraine, okay?
Okay.
Crimea belonged to Russia from the 1780s all the way through the 1950s, okay? So long after the Soviet Union was created. It was after the Second World War, 10 years after the Second World War almost, that Nikita Khrushchev the dictator, gave Crimea to Ukraine because he needed the Ukrainian Communist Party support to come to power after Stalin died. So parochial, political politics, a decree by the General Secretary of the Communist Party, right? That was all. But meanwhile, the population of Crimea was overwhelmingly Russian and identified as Russian. Now, at the end of the Cold War, Crimea voted for independence from Russia and to stay part of Crimea. To stay part of Ukraine, but just barely. And right away at the beginning, there was all kinds of controversy over whether they were going to declare independence, whether they were going to try to join Russia. And Ukraine and Russia, they had these kind of political pushing and pulling over Crimea, especially at the beginning of the 1990s, like through about 1994. And at stake is the Russians' naval base at Sevastopol, which is their only naval base that's a warm water port, unfrozen all year round. The rest of all their bases are iced over in the winter. And it's their direct access to the Black Sea and therefore the Mediterranean. Right. So it's an extremely important military base. The home of their Black Sea fleet, again, since the 1780s.
Right.
Okay. Now, that status quo held. The Russians essentially gave the Ukrainians a discount on gas if you let us keep our naval base, that kind of thing. And that was fine for 14 years. Until Barack Obama and Joe Biden overthrew the government for the second time in 10 years. Bush Jr. did it in 2004. Obama and Biden did it again in 14. And as soon as they did, the three former presidents said, now's the time to cancel the Kharkiv Pact and kick the Russians out of Sevastopol.
Which is where Sevastopol is where the base is.
I'm sorry. The base on Crimea.
Gotcha.
Right.
Sorry. Okay.
No problem.
It's like a fire hose of information.
I know. I'm sorry.
No, you're killing it.
This is why everybody's going to read the book.
Just forgive I know. People are, exactly. So I'm like, Got it. Okay.
Anyway, point being, the status quo held
Got it.
until Barack Hussein Obama and Joseph Robinette Biden forced the issue. And then Putin reacted and said, actually, no, tell you what, I'm going to keep my naval base.
That's
And what do you think what happens
2014.
if we try to take San Diego away from the United States of America?
Got it.
We would kill them until they stopped trying to take San Diego away from us. Period.
Okay, pause.
Simple as that.
Pause there. So right now, I want to go back in time. World War II ends. Eisenhower, we form the CIA. Military-industrial complex is born. We establish an empire because we're policing the world. No more Hitlers can come up, and the next Hitler is going to be the USSR. There's some conspiracy theories. Maybe this is why Kennedy was shot, that he wanted to stop Vietnam. And Vietnam is just another expansion of communism that we have to extinguish. Now we're in the 70s, Jimmy Carter, we get to Reagan, everything's escalate, more nukes, which never really made any sense to me because it takes a handful to destroy the entire planet in a day. So I didn't never understood that, but I guess it doesn't even matter. But Reagan focuses on resolving this. Gorbachev take down the wall. All right, the USSR disbands. What was our reasoning for not disbanding NATO? In other words, we promised to not expand it. And it's my understanding that we added 14 countries since then and put it right against Russia's border. How in the world has everybody forgotten that we made this promise?
Right.
What's our reasoning? Because as far as I can tell, it's stop the despots, the future Hitlers. I don't know. What is our logic for it then? What's the counter argument if it's not that?
It's a big part of it. Look, as always, it's a big conspiracy of interests involved, right? So for
Okay.
Lockheed, it's selling jets. And if the Poles can't afford them, they'll make the U.S. taxpayer give them to the Poles, right? That's all they care about. They're Lockheed Martin. That's their job, making jets, getting rid of them, right? Then for NATO-crats, they just don't want to have to get a job, right? They want to keep the bureaucracy that they already have. And if its old reason for existing is gone, then they'll find a new one. And as I talk about in the book, from the very beginning, at the end of the Cold War, they came up with this new slogan, out of area or out of business, which just meant we have to find some busy work. There is no enemy to protect Western Europe from. So if we're not protecting Western Europe, what are we doing? Well, we're definitely not getting jobs. So I know we're preventing border disputes between Hungary and Slovakia. I know we're guaranteeing civilian supremacy over the military in Poland, like there was any threat of a military dictatorship in Poland, right? They come up with excuses. And as you've heard all the time from regular people in your neighborhood too, and on TV as whatever, if it wasn't us, it would be them.
So if we don't stop Russia from violating Ukraine's sovereignty, then China is going to take Taiwan, and all of these global aggressors will see it as a sign of weakness and run rampant. True or not true? Because it would be exceptionally bad if China took Taiwan, right? I mean, that seems to make sense.
Well, look, America's policy for 50 years has been that Taiwan is part of China. Nixon, made that official American policy in 1973, 1974. And, it's true that they have more political freedom on Taiwan, but quite frankly, it really doesn't make much more of a difference to the United States of America any more than it matters who has sovereignty over the Donbass. When it comes to the international law, it's whatever America says it is. So in the case of Yugoslavia, America will break Yugoslavia into as many pieces as they can, encourage succession, and then recognize the new states, usher them and get them UN Security Council seats and all this as fast as possible, if that's what they want to do. And including, like in the case of Kosovo, in what's wholly a civil war. Like you could argue that Bosnia, in a way, was a different country or a republic, exactly how you define it, a different nation within Yugoslavia.
A fledgling democracy.
But Kosovo was a county of Serbia. It was a part of Serbia. And America under Bill Clinton said, I can start a war based on total lies, a ridiculous hoax of a genocide that never happened, 100,000 corpses that were never killed, as total make-believe nonsense like Bush's weapons of mass destruction, to start an aggressive war, to intervene in a civil war inside someone else's country in order to break off Kosovo from Serbia and protect them. So Vladimir Putin said, well, that's all I'm doing in Ukraine. I'm invading in the name of humanitarianism to break off the Donbass because I got to protect these people. And he's just invoking America's same violation of the law in order to justify what he's doing. And yet, in the case of China and Taiwan, Taiwan is already recognized as part of China. So it's not the country next door. It's not a sovereign nation state. It's a territory that right now has like pseudo independence, right? But it's like has de facto autonomy, but is part of China. So that's like saying, well, China insists that the United States has no right to Catalina Island off the coast of California. China recognizes Catalina Island as independent. We would tell them to go to hell, probably invade it tomorrow.
So wait,
We have-
Scott, why did we then change our position on Taiwan? I know there's like chips there or something. They make some sort of
Look,
microchip or
yeah, I mean, it's
some money
a
game.
mess. So going back to in the Civil War, when the nationalists escaped to Taiwan, Harry Truman sailed the 7th Fleet through there to prevent the communists from chasing them across and finishing them off and protected them. So that's how Taiwan became an American protectorate,
Got it.
run by pro-Western right-wingers. It was a military dictatorship for decades. It's a democracy now. But it was a military dictatorship under American control for decades after that.
Okay.
But then in the 1970s, Nixon and Kissinger wanted to exploit the differences between the Chinese and the Soviets, what was called the Sino-Soviet split. So they made an alliance with China. They made friends with China. And it was an unofficial handshake deal, but they broke China away from the Soviet Union. So America's Cold War with China ended in 1974, 2 years before I was born.
Okay.
And 15, 17 years before the final end of the Cold War with the Soviet Union. We were friends with the Chinese first. And so part of that deal was Nixon calculated that, do I really care about Taiwan? No. So you guys, we recognize this was the deal. We recognize that there is one China and that Taiwan is part of it. However, we strongly urge you not to retake it by force. And then I guess it was the Carter administration that later added, we're not saying exactly what we would do if you try it, but we might come to their defense.
Got
and
it.
you might have to tangle with us then. The problem is that now China has plenty of naval power to take Taiwan and to keep us away. America does not have the ability to defend Taiwan 7,000 miles from San Diego. Not a chance. They'll sink our subs, they'll sink our ships, they will splash our planes out of the sky from standoff range if we tried to defend Taiwan in a hot war.
So why do you think they
we can
don't
keep-
just take it then? What would be stopping them? Because the
Well,
argument is that this is stopping them. Fighting Putin now and making his life hell is stopping.
That's all unfalsifiable, right? I mean, it's hard to say. Listen, there's a calculation. Nobody really knows what it is. There's a calculation that says if we gave them some certain weapon systems, the Chinese might say, whoa, actually, that's a little much. We don't necessarily want to tangle with that. I don't know. However, on that same time scale or that same diagram of weapon shipments, you could also have a number of weapons systems or a certain quality of weapons put in that are actually the provocation that make the Chinese decide they better launch the attack now before it gets much worse. That's what happened in Ukraine. And at the start of the war, you had CIA guys. There's this guy, his name is Zach, and it kills me. I can never remember his name off the top of my head. I just did an interview with Dave and I couldn't remember it, but it's Zach at Yahoo News. Everybody can find it, Z-A-C-H, Zach, I'm pretty sure. And he did this whole series about the CIA in Ukraine right at the dawn of the war at the end of 21, beginning of 22. I promise everyone can find this. If you just use your search terms, you'll find it. And this guy, Zach, and I'm so sorry I can't remember his last name for you, but he has these great quotes from CIA officers whose job it was to coordinate the importation of American weapons into Ukraine during the Obama and Trump years and into Biden, right? Biden's first year. So the war broke out at the very beginning of his second year in office, right?
Right.
So these CIA officers who are bringing in the weapons, they tell Yahoo News, listen, we tried to tell them the weapons that we're bringing in are not enough to deter Russia from attacking. They are enough to provoke them into attacking. You're putting Russia in the position to say, we better do it now before it's too late, before they're so well armed that we won't be able to fix the problem later. So pouring in all those weapons, as they said, calibrating the amount of weapons they were pouring in did not deter Russia. It provoked him into launching the attack.
Oh
the same kind of thing could happen with Taiwan.
I see.
We give them enough F-16s that China says, that's it. We better hit them now before they get 10 more.
Yep.
And so.
Oh, wow. I get it.
Now, don't get me wrong, because I'm not saying that, like, oh, I'm just a wimp and a pacifist. And I say what you should never do is stand up to anyone in any circumstances, because that's always what causes fights. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is, you can't just be naive about it and say, well, I know, we'll just pour in weapons and that will deter them, and not consider whether that actually might backfire and make matters much worse, as we saw in the case of Ukraine.
Here's how I look at it personally, is that for me, if I was ever in a position, obviously, this is an extraordinarily hypothetical scenario, but I would try everything first, like DEFCONs, literally. Can we de-escalate? Can we engage in a dialogue? Let's have a negotiation. Now, if they continued to push and no peace agreement could be reached and there was aggression after aggression, well, then you have no choice but to fight. But if you're provoking the fight...
Look, again, Taiwan is part of China. It's not part of the United States of America. So maybe Taiwan has to fight. But why are Texans bound to die in a nuclear war with China over Taiwan?
Because they're our allies. And if we...
No, they're not. No, they're not. We don't have a treaty of alliance with Taiwan. It's not even a nation state.
What about NATO? NATO, I'm sorry, not NATO with Taiwan, but Ukraine now wants to join NATO, right? So they want to have this protection against Putin, who's expanding and aggressive and has been devastated ever since they broke up the USSR. So now I want to go back to kind of the beginning of this issue with Ukraine. So USSR falls, we're not expanding NATO, and I have heard different interviews of how the neocons, and I'm wondering if you could actually define that in just a moment, what a neocon is. The neocons, the Dick Cheneys of the world, all those guys you mentioned, Buchanan, we're not letting this go, we're expanding. And I've heard these plans, like guys like Jeff Sachs and yourself and Mike Benz talking about how our government was like, we got to find a way into Ukraine, and then we're going to go into Iraq, and then we're going to just keep rolling and keep moving and dominate everything. So, okay, first off, just a simple definition. What is a neocon? And who's a perfect example?
Okay. A perfect example would be Paul Wolfowitz.
Okay.
Who was the Deputy Secretary of Defense in the W. Bush years.
Got it.
I'll do you a little better than that.
Okay.
It's a biographical definition. People often misuse it to say like just a hawk or maybe a Republican nowadays. Like it sounds like that's what it means. Neo, like new, like just modern or something. But what it really means, neoconservatives, means they used to be a bunch of commies. Then they became conservatives. It's a small group of people who had been mostly Trotskyites. And now, as Americans, they sided with America in the Cold War because they hated Stalin. They were commies, but they hated Stalin because he'd betrayed Trotsky. And plus, they were Americans anyway. So
oh my God,
after World War II, the real conservatives hated war, but they all kind of got old and died. And they got replaced by the neocons. And William F. Buckley at the National Review hired just a bunch of ex-Reds to be really the founders of the conservative movement after World War II. So you had James Burnham and Cindy Hook and Whittaker Chambers and all these guys who were all a bunch of trots. Then you had Commentary Magazine, Norman Podhoretz and his people. Then you have Irving Kristol. And of course, you're more familiar with his son, Bill, the founder of the Project for a New American Century and all these other think tanks. Then you had a guy named Max Schachman, who had founded the Social Democrats USA, which had a whole bunch of, it was basically a Trotskyite group that funneled people toward the right. And then you had Leo Strauss and Albert Wohlstetter, who were professors at the University of Chicago, who were also ex-Trots, and their students. So then when you get to the end of the 1960s, what happens is liberals became hippies. They were anti-Vietnam,
Right.
and they sided against, and they were for civil rights for blacks, and they sided against Israel in the 67 war. So these neoconservatives then, in reaction to those things about what you would call like the woke left of that time, of the late 60s, they started moving to the right and became militarists and really they joined in the government. First of all, there's a major faction of them that were advisors to a Cold War Democrat, a right-wing Cold War Democrat named Scoop Jackson, who was a senator from Washington State. And they called him the senator from Boeing. And he had hired Wolfowitz and a lot of these guys, Richard Pearl, and a lot of these guys to work for him. And then in the Reagan years, a bunch of them, like, I don't know, 20 of them or something, got jobs as the Deputy Undersecretary, Assistant Secretary of Defense for some crazy thing you never heard of, right? Like they're just ensconcing themselves in kind of in the lower levels of the Pentagon. Then when the Clinton years came,
Wow.
they all went to the think tanks and they created, most importantly, the Project for a New American Century. And of course, as I said, they'd already always run the National Review, and they created the Weekly Standard magazine. They ruled the Washington Post and Wall Street Journal editorial pages, and for that matter, the New York Times. And so then in the W. Bush years, now at the turn of the century, after September 11th, it's the neoconservatives who say, we know what's going on and we know what to do, because they already had this agenda. And essentially, to boil it down, what they really are, they're ideologues of American empire. That's who they are. So then when W. Bush comes to power, Dick Cheney hired the whole dang gaggle of them, and they were the guys who lied us into war with Iraq. Especially, they had what was called the Office of Special Plans, and they brought in Michael Ledeen and Michael Rubin, and essentially Colin Powell called them the American Enterprise Institute, Heritage, the Project for a New American Century, the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, Center for Security Policy, JINSA, and some of the others. And then the rest were all Charles Krauthammer on TV and in the Washington Post saying we absolutely have to go to war with Iraq because everybody knows they helped Osama bin Laden do 9/11 and all of this
Have
stuff.
weapons of mass destruction.
And that's who the neocons are.
Whoa. Okay. Hold on, Scott. Just to put this out there. Here's what I thought a neocon was. I knew it meant neoconservative. I thought it was like Dick Cheney is a neocon because he benefits off of Halliburton, and this is why we're going into Iraq.
Right. So that's totally not right. But it's great that, look, it's totally fair that you thought that.
That's why we're doing this.
It's not your fault.
Holy
Everybody
shit.
People-
That's what I thought.
No, people terribly misuse that term. But for people who know about foreign policy studies and stuff, this is an absolute just separate and different faction. This is not the same as just saying
So these
the
are
oil
like
man.
ideologues. This is exactly what you're saying, that have this like obsession with expanding their belief system globally. Then these ideologues meet the military-industrial complex, and you have a match made in pure friggin' hell.
That's right. That's right. And that's where all those think tanks come from.
Oh my
Alexander
God.
Coburn. Andrew Coburn, his brother, the brilliant journalist and author, Andrew Coburn. He says, you want to truly understand the neoconservative movement. They are the cross between the Israel lobby and the military-industrial complex. In other words, Jillian, the bankers and the oil men, they already had their eggheads at the Council on Foreign Relations to justify everything they wanted to do. But mostly, and especially we're talking like the 70s and 80s and this kind of era, that was all very Brooks Brothers, waspy, white shoe territory. And Jews and Catholics were not as welcome. So what the neocons did was they made an alliance with the military-industrial complex, which means, like, in other words, kind of the new right from out west, from California and Texas and Washington State and Colorado and places like that. They didn't have any eggheads. They had the arms industry, but they needed nerds to write studies to justify the Pentagon buying their weapons. And so they made this deal with Richard Pearl and the neocons and really created this movement and bankrolled their effort to create all of these think tanks. So you got your Council on Foreign Relations, fine. We got 20 more. And of course, you do have Bill Kristol and Max Boot, and neocons ended up taking over the CFR itself anyway.
So the military-industrial complex utilized the ideologues to justify their position to engage in war around the world. Got it. Okay, great. I'm good. I got it. So it's not just Dick Cheney and Halliburton. That's helpful.
That's right.
Okay.
In fact, you want to know about Dick Cheney and Halliburton? I'll tell you a funny story about Dick Cheney and Halliburton real quick. Dick Cheney got hired, not because he's a businessman, but because he was the former Secretary of Defense. And Halliburton thought that they were going to get a bunch of free money from the taxpayer. But the problem was the Democrats were in power. And Dick Cheney didn't really have that much juice in Washington at that time to guarantee Halliburton a bunch of government welfare. So what good was he? Well, he wasn't a good businessman. And he and his right-hand man, I always forget the right-hand man's name, but it was his COO, or CFO. They did a terrible job investigating a company called Dresser Industries, and they bought it. They made an executive decision. The board went along with it. Fine, go ahead. And they bought Dresser Industries right before, weeks before they started being held liable for literally more than $1 billion worth of asbestos cancer claims.
Oh, so they bought Dresser Industries, who had all of these claims that they didn't know about. So they inherited all the liability from the company they bought. So now he's $1 billion in the hole and he's got to figure it out.
And now he's got to make himself the vice president and put Halliburton on the dole. And I'm not saying they threatened him or whatever, but you see how different that is than, Dick Cheney's greedy and he did it for money. He did it for money for other people who he owed a lot of money. And these guys are gangsters. Like, I'm not making any specific accusations against any specific people, but if I was the CEO of Halliburton and I screwed up and screwed them out of $1 billion, I would also make sure that I became vice president and put them on the dole, building army bases.
Okay.
It's a huge motive. And by the way, he's the same guy who explained perfectly in 1994 why not to go to Baghdad. Because Iran will get the South and the East. We'll have a problem with Syria in the West. We'll have the Kurds will want to break off. That's going to cause a problem with our friends, the Turks. We'll have urban combat where our soldiers are getting chewed up, hunting and fighting people in cities. It's terrible. And we decided there's no way Saddam Hussein is worth it. That's what Dick Cheney said in 1994.
And if you take down the central government in Iraq, you can easily end up seeing pieces of Iraq fly off. Part of it the Syrians would like to have to the west. Part of eastern Iraq, the Iranians would like to claim, fought over for 8 years. In the north, you've got the Kurds. And if the Kurds spin loose and join with the Kurds in Turkey, then you threaten the territorial integrity of Turkey. It's a quagmire if you go that far and try to take over Iraq. The other thing was casualties. Everyone was impressed with the fact that we were able to do our job with as few casualties as we had. But for the 146 Americans killed in action and for their families, it wasn't a cheap war. And the question for the president, in terms of whether or not we went on to Baghdad and took additional casualties in an effort to get Saddam Hussein, was how many additional dead Americans is Saddam worth? And our judgment was not very many, and I think we got it right.
Yeah, everybody can look it up on YouTube. So interview at AEI, at the American Enterprise Institute.
So then,
and he's the same guy who turned around 9 years later and caused exactly the crisis that he said would happen if he did it.
Because the Halliburton was $1 billion in debt.
And because that was what Benjamin Netanyahu wanted.
My God, I don't even know anything about Benjamin Netanyahu. Table that one. Hold on. It's another show. So okay. So now we're beginning this Ukraine situation, right? And we begin with the expansion of NATO that we promise we won't do. Now, we're expanding NATO under the pretense of policing the world as good guys, but for all the reasons you said, to maintain our empire, to sell weapons, because our military industrial complex is selling weapons to those countries in NATO, right?
Oh, sure. Everybody has to standardize their military to American spec, which means you got to buy U.S. weapons. And by the way, I hope I didn't sell too short the idea that these people really do. I did mention a couple times, they really do believe that they're the good guys here. They really do believe, as I was paraphrasing them, that if it wasn't us, it'd be somebody else worse. They really fancy themselves heroes the whole time. So if it sounds to your audience like I'm saying, oh, they just want that filthy money because of that incentive, then that's oversimplifying it, and even to a degree that it is nonsensical that people would go so far over just that. It really is the ideology of American empire. And you could even, if you want, you could trace it back to the Puritans, that like, we're not just a country full of people. We got a special destiny, and it includes bossing you around because you're just not as good as we are. And it's always been that way. Woodrow Wilson invaded Mexico to teach them to elect good men. That's America is Hillary Clinton. I'm sorry, but like isn't that the perfect thing? Do you think that she questions herself and her own motivations and her own virtue ever in any way? She knows she's right, no matter how wrong she is, and no matter how even self-interested she is. She knows that even if it's because she's mongering for power, it's because she needs that power to hold the world together so it all doesn't go wrong. She believes that about herself and about her peers. They all do. That's how they think. And so, man, if we don't dominate Poland, Russia will come back for it. They just believe that. They know it must be true.
That is the
to justify
argument.
what they're doing.
Scott, I gotta be honest, that's somewhat comforting to me, simply because I had started to really think this is just a money laundering scheme, and we're killing all these people all around the world because the military industrial complex needs to sell jets and they need to sell guns.
Right.
And
well, too.
That too.
Right?
But at least
that too. Hey, look, on TV, they got to sell dish soap. And it's a big deal. Man, when they have a war, I mean, you remember what a big deal it was. COVID was basically had run its course. They were ready to switch. They needed a new thing. So it was Ukraine to the 10th degree, or, the nth degree. They push it as hard as they can for their own special, narrow interests.
Got it.
And by the way, if you listen to most of these people, politicians in Washington, talk about these things, you notice that they only speak in cliches, mostly because they don't know the first thing about it either.
Yeah, they don't.
You know that they promised not to expand NATO. I would bet you that most of the 535 sitting in the House and the Senate don't even know that that's true. That they promised that we won't take advantage of the Soviets' withdrawal from Eastern Europe, but that's exactly what we did. And I do know this is a great anecdote that came from an article by Christopher Lane. He said he was consulting with the military, with high-level officers, I guess generals and admirals and things. And he would say to them, he would just ask them, like in a straight way, like he's not making an analogy, he would just ask them straight, hey guys, what would we do if China set up shop and built a military base in Mexico and started training up Mexican troops and this kind of thing? Created a treaty of military alliance with Mexico. And they said, well, we would immediately ramp up sanctions and threats. And if that didn't work, we would invade, of course. And then Lane would say to them, so how do you think Russia feels when we do all this in Ukraine? And Lane says, people can find this in Harper's, it's Layne in Harper's. And he says, to a man, these generals and admirals all looked at him and said, I guess we never really thought of it that way.
Come on, bullshit, Scott. Of course they would have to think. Okay.
I don't know. I don't know.
So hold on. All right. I want to go back again. Forgive me. I'm taking you off piece quite a bit here.
It's my fault. Go ahead.
No, it's not
No
actually.
problem.
So now so I'm back to you. I'm still on step one. If we promised not to expand NATO, and we did. Okay, so now we know that. And then I want to talk a bit about this memo that leaks. I guess Julian Assange leaked some memo through WikiLeaks that went from like the head of the CIA to Condoleezza Rice that says "niet" means "niet." Can we talk about this for a second? And the reason I want to establish this is because I think it shows that for quite some time, we had every intention of adding Ukraine to NATO. I think we've established why it's advantageous for America to have NATO expand, or not America, but the military-industrial complex. And we knew better. But I don't know enough about this memo. I've heard about it. Can you speak about this for a second? When did it happen? From who to who? What does it say? And what begot the memo? Why was this memo created?
Right. Okay. So I'm about 99% sure it was February 8th of 2000, or maybe it was February 30 of 2008. And it's by our current CIA director, William Burns.
Right.
And anyone can find this at wikileaks.org. It's called Niet Means Niet. It's only, 700 words or something. Everybody have no problem reading it.
Okay.
And he was at that time the ambassador to Russia. And he's writing the memo to his boss, Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. And he's warning her that he has spoken with Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, and for that matter, with all other different thought leaders inside and outside of government in Russia. And that everyone says the same thing, which is you better not offer NATO membership, or a membership action plan is what it's called, the next step toward bringing Ukraine or Georgia into the NATO alliance. Just don't do it. It's, he said, the brightest of red lines. And he quotes Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, saying, if you do this, it could cause a civil war inside Ukraine, and that would put us in a position to decide whether or not to intervene, a decision that we do not want to have to face. So for God's sake, please don't put us in this position. Then Burns is not just informing Rice that, well, that's what Lavrov said. He's telling her, Madam Secretary, you need to listen to this. This is important. This is right. This is the brightest red line. He says, from the dark, I forget if this is the same memo or this is an email he sent her a few weeks later. He says, from the most enlightened liberals to the most brutish knuckle draggers in the darkest recesses of the Kremlin, everyone is agreed about this. You could cause a war. It's very, very, and Fiona Hill warned about this, and Vladimir Putin himself warned that if you try to bring Ukraine into NATO,
right,
I'll just wreck it. I'll just break the thing. Putin said the East, he said the west of the country was a gift from the Eastern Europeans, meaning like the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It was part of Poland, Galicia and Volhynia. This is part of Eastern Europe, separate from like core Ukraine. And then far Eastern Ukraine is really Russian territory, the Donbass, Novorossiya, the four eastern and southern provinces, and then the fifth, the Crimean Peninsula there. And he's saying, well, look, this is not even a real country. So if it comes down to that, I'll just break it into pieces, man. I'm not going to let you do this. And I have the exact quote in the book. He's just said this as plain as day to W. Bush, I believe in 2007. And then why did Bush go ahead? For legacy building purposes, for his own personal singular man purposes, not for the good of the United States of America or the people of Europe or the people of Ukraine, but so he could be said to have done something right after he absolutely ruined Iraq War II and everything else. That's his own people's words, that they said that about him. This was a legacy building operation for him, and is why he went over the dead body of Angela Merkel and Francois Hollande, the Chancellor of Germany and President of France, who tried to stop him. And they said they absolutely put their foot down for only one reason. It's an unnecessary provocation against Russia. They had no other reason. It wasn't because it cost too much money. It wasn't because they didn't want to share drinks at the cocktail party. It was because you're shoving this right in the face of Vladimir Putin, and he's liable to do something dangerous and terrible in reaction.
And this is 2008.
Right.
Okay.
Right. And Burns...
So what exactly did we do then? Is this our first attack? So hold on, Scott, forgive me.
Okay.
So
yeah.
He tells Condoleezza, don't do it. All right, great. That's, years prior to this. We don't do it, but then in 2008, we decide, now's the time. And
we gave him not quite a membership action plan, but we gave them like an official invitation to join.
In
Like,
2008.
kinda
How many
half
years
measure.
after the Condoleezza memo was this from Burns?
This is 3 months later.
Oh my
In
God, it's 3
in
months later?
April.
Oh,
Yes, in April
I
of
got
'08.
lost in my
Right.
So he
No, it's
specifically
okay.
says don't do it. And
Right.
3 months later, we're like, hey, NATO, check it out. Why don't you
And they do it,
consider,
yeah.
or I'm
That's
sorry,
right.
not hey, NATO, hey, Ukraine, check it out. Here's a plan to join NATO.
And Georgia too. And Georgia too. And listen, it was the CIA, the embassy in Moscow, the National Intelligence Council, and whatever, all of them advised against it. They all said not to do it. You may be familiar with Fiona Hill, the British American Russia expert who testified against Trump at Ukraine Gate. It's fun. She looks like Marcy from Peanuts with the straight, flat line for her mouth. Really weird lady. Anyway, she worked for, I believe, W. Bush, Obama, and Trump. And she told the New York Times, now she would say, you believe Russian propaganda if you just listen to her and repeat exactly what she said, which is she bragged about this on numerous occasions that she was so wise and knowledgeable that she warned W. Bush not to do it, just like Burns. She told him it's an unnecessary provocation of Russia. And furthermore, she told the Times she was speaking for the entire community of Russia experts in the CIA, on the National Intelligence Council, and on the National Security Council. They all agreed this is a terrible mistake. Don't do it.
Oh, who
And
did it?
Burns, he wrote a follow-up email to Condoleezza Rice where he's trying to talk her out of it. And at one point, you can see his frustration in the thing. He quotes this in his memoir. He says, Madam Secretary, if you're not with me by now, you might as well just stop reading now. I just don't know what else to tell you. This, I'm saying, don't do it. You are going to cause a terrible reaction. And then what happened? 3 months later, and it's not that just Russia reacted this way. It was also America's sock puppet's fault. In Georgia, the puppet president, Mikhail Saakashvili, launched a war to try to retake the breakaway provinces of South Ossetia and Abkhazia because you can't join NATO if you don't have settled borders. So he tried to settle his borders by force so that
Okay, hold on,
he
Scott.
could join.
Let me
Yeah.
do the idiot recap here. So hold on.
No problem.
We go to the
Please.
countries on the border of Russia, which we promised never to do. We get a hard don't do it. We're going to Georgia, we're going to Ukraine, we're giving them a plan. Okay. We put the guy in charge of Georgia in, he was a puppet, so and yet another one of our kind of coups of like putting in
2003, the Rose Revolution of '03, and that's in the book too.
I know that we do this. Like we put these bad guys in power in the Philippines. It wasn't Gaddafi another one of them. It's like
No.
he wasn't. Okay. There was the Marco, whatever the fuck, the Philippines guy. Didn't we do that with him?
Marcos, yeah, he was America's guy for a long time.
Okay. So you're saying we go in. Who's going in, by the way? I heard something that it's like an organization that was formed by like an NGO that was formed by the CIA and they have a
No,
name.
you're right.
Okay,
That's exactly right.
So tell me I'm sorry, Scott.
You're doing
So
fine.
who's
This is great. This is fun. This is fun.
I apologize. It's like, you're like an astrophysicist and I'm in, addition and subtraction, but that's
No, not at all. You're doing fine. It's called the National Endowment for Democracy. And they do, the way that they say it kind of tongue in cheek is that we do openly what the CIA does secretly. And they say that in fact, people get in so much trouble for being tied to the CIA. Openness is its own protection. They just brag that, yeah, we gave hundreds of thousands of dollars to this group and hundreds of thousands of dollars to that group and a few million to this group. And we built this media organization. And they just claim that it's all in the name of simply little d democracy.
Yes.
We only just want a democratic functioning system in your country. But of course, that's not what they want. They want for their guy to win. And if he doesn't win, then they hold a protest and finance and bankroll a revolution until they get their way, or they try. These are called the color-coded revolutions. The Rose Revolution, well, first of all, the Bulldozer Revolution in Serbia in 2000, the Rose Revolution in Georgia in '03, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine in '04, the Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan in '05.
That's what that
Um,
means?
this-
Those are all the ones where we went in and we overthrew the government and we put in our guy?
That's right. See, we're all looking at Iraq where George Bush is just obliterating people. But at the same time, he's waging this covert campaign to overthrow any government that's friendly to Russia on their periphery.
That's what that means. That's what the color-coded revolutions are. And that's
Yes,
what
ma'am.
this organization created by the CIA is. And that's ultimately how we got Zelensky, isn't it? So I was under the impression...
Almost, not
Exactly.
sort of, kind of, yes. So he came later. He was elected in 2019, but he was elected under the form of the new coup regime, yes, that Obama installed in 14.
Okay, so I digress. So we put this guy in our what's the name of that organization again, created by the CIA?
National Endowment for Democracy.
The National Endowment for Democracy. What a clever name. It's like gender-affirming care.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
the worst
exactly.
medical
Isn't it?
privacy.
Perfect.
Gender-affirming
right.
care. The National
That's right,
Endowment...
begging the question.
The National Endowment of Democracy puts this guy, guy goes in Georgia, we put in our guy. Now he's got to go start a bunch of wars because in order to join NATO, he needs secure borders. And is this what provoked Putin to go into Georgia?
Yes. This is what started the Georgia War of 2008, August 2008. Saakashvili launched the war. The first thing he did was bomb apartment complexes full of civilians, hundreds of civilians to death, and he killed Russian peacekeepers who were there under a legitimate deal, under international law, brokered by the EU and rubber stamped by the UN Security Council, I believe, certainly by the European Union. It was a legitimate deal that had the Russian peacekeepers there, and Russian peacekeepers were killed right away in the attack. And so Putin responded by rolling his military forces in there. And now look, they could have sacked Tbilisi and they could have just seized all of Georgia. They could have destroyed the BTC pipeline. They didn't. They stopped short of the pipeline. They stopped short of the capital. They destroyed the Georgian offensive force, and then they withdrew back to South Ossetia, which they've now, guaranteed independence under Russia protection. But that was, you see how, remember at the start of the thing where you were like, okay, so what they say is, well, he did this and he did this and he did this.
He
But you see how-
invaded Chechnya and he invaded Georgia and he went into Ukraine numerous times and and we did nothing and we did nothing and we were so patient and we tried so hard and then finally Niet means yet. And now he's got Korean troops in there and we got to do something. And if we don't do something, nobody will.
Right.
And then
So now let's talk about the current war, for example. These same people and their slogans.
Shit.
Look at what they've done, Jillian. They cost the Ukrainian nation state and the people of that land, they've cost them hundreds of thousands of casualties, certainly high tens of thousands killed, probably more than that killed. They have lost permanently Luhansk and Donetsk, and almost certainly also Zaporozhye and Kherson.
These are all territories within Ukraine.
That's right. These are like large, if Ukraine is like the size of Texas, can think of these as very large counties.
What happened in 2014?
Right. It's okay. And let me say now, I apologize, and this is my fault because I'm so long-winded, but I do have a hard out in 7 minutes.
Okay, I got you.
I'm happy to stick with you until then.
Okay.
Okay, so in 14, the bottom line is it was essentially an association agreement with the European Union that was at issue. And they say, oh, it was the pro-Russian president, but he wasn't really pro-Russian. He was trying to break away from Russian influence. His name was Yanukovych, and he wanted to join the EU. But the EU drove too hard of a bargain. I'm sorry, I'm overstating it. It's sign an association agreement with the EU. But they were driving way too hard of a bargain. And then Putin played his hardball too. So if you have a deal with them, you can't have a deal with me. But while they were demanding a severe austerity regime, cutting back subsidies on fuel and pension programs for old people and all these things, and barely loaning them enough to even make their interest payments on their last loans, Putin was offering them a $15 billion loan, $5 billion right up front, and a sweet deal on gas and all of this stuff. And Henry Kissinger even blamed Angela Merkel. It was her fault for playing too hard a hardball on the EU side and ruining the deal. So people say, oh, Putin, but Henry Kissinger himself blamed it on Merkel for not being a good negotiator, and they blew it. But when that happened, the nationalists of Western Ukraine were really pissed because this meant to them another life sentence under Russian sway, if not total dominance. But it would mean that they're, in the fight between which major power is dominant over Ukraine, they would prefer the West than Russia. And so they reacted. And they reacted with the help of hundreds of millions of dollars from the National Endowment for Democracy, the International Republican Institute, National Democratic Institute, and every George Soros organization that you can think of, the International Renaissance Foundation, and 100 more. And they poured tens of millions of dollars into supporting this fake revolution. Again, another color-coded revolution. This time it wasn't so much a color. It was the Maidan Revolution, the Euro-Maidan Revolution. And they made it happen. And it's a complicated mess. I describe it all in the book. Essentially, they were trying to force the guy to agree to new elections.
In 2014.
The deal in which he did agree to new elections, he agreed to pull his police back if the protesters would pull their forces back. Well, his guys abided by their side of the deal, but even to a degree beyond the deal, and essentially just left downtown. They just left town. I think the bosses fled, and then the lower down guys just skedaddled. Well, then, I'm not just saying the protesters. I mean real A-word Nazi, Hitler-loving, very far all the way to the right-wing radical rightists are the ones who led the putsch and seized the capital city and forced the president to flee.
So this is why they keep saying there's neo-Nazis in Ukraine and it's extremely corrupt.
They're the ones who accomplished the putsch for the United States in 2014.
Oh my
and that led to the current war. I explain in the book, this goes back to World War II, of course. Ukraine was dominated by the horrible Soviet communists who starved millions in the Holodomor. So when the Nazis came, a lot of people, especially in the far west of the country, they sided with Hitler and helped him commit the Holocaust against Jews and others in Ukraine during World War II. And then the Soviets won the war. And so the CIA backed the Nazis during the Cold War for years in a covert operation until the end of the 1950s. And these are the same Nazi groups who, when the Cold War ended, we went back over there.
The CIA, Scott?
Oh, yeah, come on.
Okay.
Yes, as soon as the Cold War was on, America befriended all of their Nazi enemies and their Japanese enemies and immediately used them against the Reds. That's where that whole thing in Orwell comes from about our enemy is East Asia. No, our enemy is Eurasia. And then we just switch back and forth again. Because we just finished fighting the Germans and the Japanese. And then immediately they're our best friends. And it's our Soviet allies who are our enemies.
Oh my God.
We switch around all the time.
Okay, I'm losing you in 3 minutes. And I feel like I'm just starting to understand. I want to jump friggin' in front of a bus. Okay. Fuck. All right, so hold on a second. So now, okay. How do I get to Zelensky? I got 2 minutes to go. Zelensky.
Okay. Zelensky was elected in 2009 to make peace. He ran on peace. He's a Russian speaker from Kharkiv, or right around there, from the eastern half of the country, not the far east.
2009.
But and he's Jewish, so he's not ethnic Russian or ethnic Ukrainian. So he can kind of split the difference, hopefully, maybe, and make a deal. And I'm sorry to report to you, and as I detail in the book, the Nazis said, look, we'll just murder you and then you'll be dead. You'll be hanging from a tree on the main drag in Kiev. You are not going to make peace or we'll murder you to death, period. And they cited it over and over again. And the New York Times says, hey, this is a credible threat. These people have overthrown their government twice. They could do it again.
You're not going to make peace with Russia.
That's right. So you will not make peace. We will fight.
All right, we basically just, this is the tip of the iceberg here. We're just scratching the surface. So the reality is, I could keep you for 10 shows. Where do people get the book? Because I seriously think we've maybe covered a chapter of your book right now. Where do they get it? Everywhere, I'm guessing. Tell everybody where to find you, where to get the book. Because I didn't even pages of notes. There's so much more to learn from you, and I've kept you for an hour and a half.
Well, I've had a great time talking with you. It's been very nice to meet you. And I do hope you do. And I know the book is a monster, but I hope you have the opportunity maybe over the Christmas holidays to get it read and get back to me. Then we'll have a whole other set of conversations about all the stuff in there.
Okay, can we do that? Let's do this.
Of course.
Scott,
yes, ma'am.
Part 1. Okay?
Sure.
Let's come back.
Happy to.
And I'm going to leave everybody here. This is part 1. And because I forced you into this interview immediately because the world is in a state of complete chaos and disarray. I haven't even had a chance to read it yet for that reason. So if we could say, this is Education Part 1. You've left me at the chapter where we're just meeting Zelensky. And we're going to pick it up, and I'm going to put this up in the next couple of weeks from here, if that's okay. And I'll make myself available when you have time.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And your listeners will have all read it by then, too. So it'll be...
Yeah. Okay. Get the book available everywhere.
That's right. It's at Amazon on Kindle as well as paperback. I'm working on the hardback. That'll be another couple of weeks, I guess. But the hardback's coming soon. You can just go to Amazon or provokedbook.com, and don't be alarmed. It'll forward you just to my website, scotthorton.org. And you can sign up for my podcast feed there as well if you're interested. But the book is Provoked. My previous book is about the war on terrorism. It's called Enough Already. And this one, the new one, is Provoked, all about the Cold War. And I really hope everybody likes it.
All right. Part 1, to be continued. I'll be ready for you next time. We left off at meeting Zelensky. I'll go do your thing, and I'll talk to you soon. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the podcast, please like, comment, subscribe, and share. And make sure to let me know what guests you want to see on in the future.